Hello, everybody. We are live. This is so exciting. All right. So, welcome to another edition of Nature in Your Classroom. And you might have joined us 2 weeks ago for our grade 3 session on leaf links, differences between plants, where Will was sharing information with you and taking you on a virtual field trip. Well, today we will be talking about biodiversity. So, this aligns with the grade 6 curriculum. It's one of my favorite topics. And when it comes to biodiversity, even though it goes with this grade 6 curriculum, I'd love to give a shout out to the other classes, other grades that are here. So I know there are some grade 7s, some grade 4s, 5s watching. So hello to everybody that's joining us today. This is really exciting. My name is Raya, and I am a teacher with Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Now we also have somebody else here with us today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Will.
Will is giving us a hand. We're trying to keep our physical distance from each other here. And Will and I are both Watershed on Wheels educators with Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. We actually usually go into schoolyards. We do in-class and schoolyard programs about the environment. Since we can't do that right now, given the pandemic, we're reaching you virtually instead, and we're following COVID-safe protocols to do that. So before we begin with the topic, I just wanted to cover a couple of little things. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. If you have any comments or answers to my questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm going to try to address questions as we go, but that might be a little bit tricky. So we'll do our best. And if I don't, then at the very end, we'll definitely have a question period so we can address everything, okay? So, oh, one more thing. If you, some of you have a worksheet that goes along with the live stream. If you don't, that's totally fine. You can 100% watch the live stream anyway. And if you'd emailed me this morning for the worksheet, I didn't quite get it to you, I'll send it to you afterwards. And students, you guys can still do it after the live stream. See what you remember from the live stream, okay? So let's get started. Now, first thing I'm going to do is actually ask you to close your eyes. And we're going to play a recording of a habitat for you. And when you're listening, I want you to be counting how many different organisms, so how many different types of animals do you hear? So if we're ready for hearing the audio, Will? Great. And you can close your eyes now. Thank you very much. So I'm curious, and you can open your eyes now. How many different organisms did you hear? You can type it in the chat. If there are any particular organisms that you know the sound of, you can actually put the name of the organism, the animal, into the chat as well. And Will, can I ask, what kinds of animals are we seeing come up in our chat right now? Have people started commenting? There's a bit of a lag sometimes. All right, we're going to give it another 10 seconds. Will, can you play that again just for about 10 more seconds? Let's see what we can hear in that recording. So if you heard maybe frogs, I believe there was a chorus frog in that mix. You might have heard some different types of birds. There were actually a lot of different bird sounds. There was actually, it was like music to my ears, a diverse array of organisms in that audio clip. That was taken in a bog that I visited last year in the springtime. And there were American robins, there were common grackles, blue-gray gnatcatchers, a few different types of bird species not to mention the frogs that were there. So in that 30-second clip, we heard at least 5 or 6 different types of organisms. And because there were different types of organisms, that means there was a fair amount of biodiversity. So let's look at that word for a second. Whenever I learn a new word or want to understand a word better, I like to break it down into its parts. And when it comes to biodiversity, we can look at the bio part and then diversity. So bio basically means living things. Bio is of life. Diversity means a variety, so different types of things. In this case, different types of life. Bio is of life, diversity is variety, and in that bog, we heard that there was a variety of life. There was biodiversity in that bog. And we can decide for different habitats, is there high biodiversity, is there low biodiversity, or is it somewhere in the middle? Now, this photo here, that's hopefully showing up below me, yes? It's. I'm going to ask you, students, if you think this has high biodiversity or low biodiversity. And in your classroom or in your virtual classroom, if you're in a classroom, just do a thumbs up for high, thumbs down for low. If you're in a virtual classroom setting, then put a yes in the chat, like a Y or an N. And I'm curious to know if you have thoughts on this particular habitat here. We're seeing a lot of a particular plant, the sunflower, one of the sunflowers. But are there different types of plants, or is it just the one? It looks like there's mostly just one type of plant. Now, in that case, I would say the biodiversity is pretty low. Beautiful picture, beautiful scene, but low biodiversity. That is what we call a monoculture. So you already know I like to break words down. Culture is to grow. Mono means one. So monoculture means there's like one thing growing, basically. All right. So we've talked about biodiversity and what that is. We've established that low biodiversity could be like a monoculture, only one type of thing growing. Let's go for a bit of a walk. And we're going to be walking around this natural community behind me and exploring some of the diversity in this space. So I'm going to just take you off the tripod here and take you with me. Here we go. It's a beautiful sunny day out here. I'm going to be squinting a little bit. And let's check out what are some of the plants that we can see here. So one of them, I'm going to flip my screen so you can see these plants better. There we go. Much better. So one of these plants that I've been walking past is the eastern white cedar. And some of you might have learned a little bit of how this plant plays a big role in history. Today we're going to be talking about its natural aspects of the plant. So it has a lovely smell to it. If you've ever smelled cedar, it's just delightful. And there are birds that really enjoy eating the seeds of the cedar. So there's an interrelationship there between the bird species that eat the seeds and the cedar tree itself. Interrelationship is like how two or more different organisms, different things interact with each other. So in this case, we've got the cedar and the birds interacting because the birds are actually eating those seeds. And as they're flying around, they might be spreading those seeds to other areas. So this way, the cedar is actually growing in other spots because of the seeds being spread by the birds. Now, here's another plant that we can have a look at. So this one, well, I've got you in the shade here. Let's see if I can fix that. That's the trouble with a sunny day is we get shade, right? So this plant here, the plant is on its way to going dormant for the winter. Usually, the flowers of this plant, I'm going to show you a picture of what they look like. Usually they're purple. They're this lovely splash of purple. So in the early fall, this is what we'd see. The picture makes it look huge, but they're actually small. It's called New England Aster. And the New England Aster has a really fantastic interrelationship with a lot of insect organisms. So for instance, this guy here likes to pollinate the New England Aster. Well, actually, they like to drink the nectar. So they take nectar from one flower And as they're drinking that nectar, some of the pollen from the flower rubs onto their very fuzzy bellies and fuzzy legs, and then they'll fly to another flower. And as they're drinking nectar from that flower, that pollen rubs off onto the other flower. And so they're actually moving the pollen around. And that is the only way that this plant can make seeds. So that's a really fantastic interrelationship between the New England Aster and a lot of other wildflowers and bees and other insects. As we keep exploring this natural community, we're seeing some buckthorn, which isn't necessarily a great thing. There's some more cedar. And, oh, I see a plant coming up that I'm going to show you. This is a plant that kind of gets a bad reputation, although it shouldn't. It'll be blurry for a second as I go quickly to it. So this plant here, super fluffy, super awesome. It's kind of yellow before it goes to seed. This is goldenrod. And people often think that goldenrod is what causes allergies in the fall. But the goldenrod pollen it's insect pollinated. So insects move it around rather than wind. The culprit is actually ragweed, which is a whole other plant. And ragweed is pollinated by the wind. So that's what causes allergies in some folks in the fall. Goldenrod is a wonderful plant, again, for pollinators, like I mentioned. And I've also seen birds enjoying eating parts of the goldenrod plant. Now, it looks like there's a really amazing forest back here. Let's have a bit of a journey into the forest. See what's back here. Okay, it looks like we have a tree that had come down a little while back. And if we look more closely at part of this tree that came down, I'm just going to go through these branches here. We can see a great example of an interrelationship on this tree. These holes, what do you think could have made these holes? So imagine the tree being upright. These holes were made a long time ago when the tree was still standing. And these holes were actually made by a type of woodpecker. There are lots of different types of woodpeckers. Ones that make these kinds of large square holes, almost, they can be square. They are called pileated woodpeckers. I think Woody Woodpecker, that was a pileated woodpecker there. So there's a really amazing interrelationship between woodpeckers and trees, where it might not benefit the tree necessarily, but part of a tree's purpose in a habitat is to have these relationships with other organisms. And woodpeckers might be looking for insects as they're pecking in to a tree. They might be creating a cavity big enough for themselves to nest in. What often happens is that other birds will nest in these beautiful large woodpecker holes. So there's even an interrelationship between the woodpecker and other bird species who might not even be in the same space, but the woodpeckers made a lovely little nesting shelter for the other bird. Okay, here we go. Backing up, trying to find my way out of this jungly forest. It's not really a jungle though, just to be clear. And once we get back into a slightly more open space, I'd like to look up. So as we look up, I'm not sure if you can see in the distance there, there is an old bird's nest that's come down there. So there's another relationship with birds nesting in trees. Treetops can be really important for hawks and other types of birds that like to have a good vantage point, basically. So if they're in a treetop, they can look down and they can then see what kinds of prey might be down below. So different rodents that could be potentially scurrying across a field. All right, looking back down again, we have checked out some different organisms, some plant organisms in our forest natural community. And here we are at a forest edge, kind of overlapping a bit with the idea of maybe being a meadow type space. And you might have an idea of, okay, well, that forest, Raya said there were some different plants there. Yeah, there might be some biodiversity. If we wanted to have a really scientific approach to evaluating, to deciding and investigating how much biodiversity is in a space? Well, we could start at one end of this space here and start counting every single plant in this space and writing it down, and then we'd have a nice long list at the end of all the individual plants that are growing here. But you probably have recess or lunch coming up or something like that, and we're not going to be here all day doing that. So what ecologists, an ecologist is somebody who studies habitats, type of scientist. So what ecologists or scientists do, rather than counting every single plant, they want to take samples of that habitat. And so they will use what are called quadrats. And a quadrat is basically a frame that can be placed in the habitat in different sample spots. Sometimes the frame has strings that kind of form a bit of a grid, so they can get even more particular about where their plants are that they're finding, or their animals if they happen to find animal organisms. It can be a circle. You can even use a hula hoop. So you can get a hula hoop into your habitat and move your way in to start looking at what different organisms are growing there. Now, I actually set up a rope quadrat earlier. And so this orange rope that I've placed, I wanted to get a tree in mine. Usually you would just do it randomly, but I was kind of aiming for that tree to be in my quadrat. So I've got this rope length, and I can afterwards place it somewhere else. And as long as the rope is the same length, it's still capturing the same area. So we want to have that standard unit or standard area that's captured. So it is time for us to have a closer look at what is in this quadrat. What do we see? We're basically going to be counting different organisms in the quadrat. So we've got this red stemmed plant here. Kind of seems a bit like a woody stem. And we don't need to know the names of them to know how many different types of organisms there are. I happen to know this one is called Dogwood. It's red osier dogwood. But that's one. So we've got one so far. And there are a few of them, but we've already counted it. So that's one type of organism. Let's see how much more biodiversity we have in here. So this plant, I'm going to come around the stem of the dogwood. This one here is another type. It's got sort of frilly leaves there. And I believe that's a type of vetch. So that would be a second type of organism. As we come in close, I wonder if we can see this on the camera. There is a type of leaf here that we haven't noticed yet. It's a bit heart-shaped, some bumps on the margins. So that's a third type of organism. And if we move across here, let's see, do we have another one? What's this one? That looks the same as the last one. So we're still only at 3. Okay, let's keep looking. There is this grass that's growing here. So that would be 4. There's another plant in here with more oval-shaped leaves. So that's 5. And it looks like there are quite a few of that plant. And there is, there's a stem here, this brown stem. As we go up, we can see that this, sorry about that. This stem has little tiny fuzzy, kind of Velcro-y seeds, actually. How many is that? I think I lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is number 5. It's always good to check out what's growing right at the soil level. And can you see that? Let me clear this away. Can you see that moss in there? So we've got some moss growing there as well. Now, if this was spring or summer, we would probably see some beetles and organisms like that, but it's kind of too cold for them to be scurrying around right now. So I think we're at 6 with the moss, if I'm counting correctly. And here's one that we haven't seen yet. So there's 7. That's another one. And finally, this lovely tree that is in our quadrat. So this tree happens to be a white paper birch tree, and that would be then 8 different organisms in this quadrat. Now, when we're looking at similarities and differences between these different organisms, well, we see that the dogwood kind of has a woody stem, much like the birch tree has a woody stem. And the leaf shape here is, you could call it kind of serrated. That means it's got that bumpy edge to it, versus the leaf shape of this plant over here with its smooth edge. So we're seeing some characteristics of the leaves themselves, of the type of material they're made out of. And there's actually an excellent app, if you're not familiar with it, called Seek. It's by iNaturalist. And we're going to add some videos, video links to the description on how to use Seek and iNaturalist, because it gets you into, okay, what class is this plant in? What order, what family, what genus, and what species? So you can really get into classifying these plants and also animals in a great way. So we've been investigating this quadrat at the edge of our forests. And I don't know if you know, but I've actually been coming to you from a space that has an open field as well. And what I'm going to do is place the quadrat into the field spot. Let me just put my camera down here, make sure it doesn't tumble. Hard to find even ground sometimes. Okay, are we a bit crooked? That's okay. So I've removed my rope, and I'm just going to place the rope somewhere on our lawn here. So I'm at Lake St. George Field Center. It's one of our overnight field centers where usually we have overnight field trips, and there's lots of wilderness here, but we've also got some open areas for activities. Okay, same area because the rope is the same length as it was for the last one. And let's have a look at what's in this one here. So in this quadrat sample, we're seeing grass. We're seeing actually that same kind of serrated edged or frilly edged leaf there. That's 2. We've got what looks like dandelion growing here as well. So that's 3. Are we seeing any other organisms, any other species? So as we're scanning this area, we can compare the amount of biodiversity from one to the other. There is one more little guy in here that we haven't noted yet. So if we have 4 organisms in this one, and again, I lost count in the other one. I think we had 8 in the end, 7 or 8. Think to yourself, which one has higher biodiversity? Our open field or our, less maintained, let me move my camera over, kind of wilderness area here? And a part of what gives the wilderness area higher biodiversity is that it's not mown. So plants actually have a chance to establish, have a chance to grow. And it's also not run around on. So plants that might be sensitive to being trampled, they don't have to worry about somebody stepping all over them and things like that. Whereas our field area, we're actually right by a lake. I don't know if you can see that lake there, just past the plants as well, which is lovely. So the field area is it's closer to a monoculture. It's not quite a monoculture because we do have a few species. We saw 4, but it's closer to a monoculture. I'm going to flip my screen again, and I want to talk with you about a couple of things. There we go. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think biodiversity is important, right? We're talking about biodiversity, but we haven't actually really addressed why we're talking about biodiversity. So we have explored different interrelationships between different organisms. We have seen that animals and plants might rely on each other. I take a deep breath. I'm breathing in oxygen that these plants around me probably produced. So everything is interrelated. Everything is connected. This connection is so valuable for a healthy planet. And this connection is part of why biodiversity is important, or these connections, I should say. So because everything's connected, if we had low biodiversity in plants, then we would end up with low biodiversity in animals. And if the biodiversity is low enough for a long enough period of time and we haven't corrected that, then us humans are animals too. We would feel that impact as well. So that's one reason. Everything is connected. Remember that. Another thought is that, well, let's say you had a forest, and in your forest there were ash trees growing, or maybe spruce trees, but that's it. And into that forest habitat, into that ecosystem, enters the emerald ash borer or the spruce beetle. So these are insects that attack these particular organisms, these particular trees, and they do a pretty good job of taking care of those trees, meaning that they kind of destroy them over time. So if you only have one or two of those tree species and one or two of those insect species comes in, your whole forest is pretty much done for. Now, let's say you had a forest that had ash and spruce and willow and maple and birch and all these other types of trees, and you have emerald ash borer come into that forest. Well, that emerald ash borer might wipe out the ash trees, but the other trees survive. And so you still have a forest habitat. That means that the animals that were relying on that forest habitat for shelter or for food and so forth, they still have a home to be in. So a habitat that has lower biodiversity is a habitat that is kind of weaker and more susceptible to destruction, really. So, sorry, I was just getting distracted for a second there. I'm easily distracted by things around me. This morning, actually, when I got to this site, there were 3 beautiful, healthy deer that were running off into the forest back here, and birds and things around me distract me very, very quickly. So we've talked about why biodiversity is important. We mentioned the interrelationships, everything's connected. We talked about how high biodiversity means that a habitat is stronger and it's more resistant to disease and getting injured. Let's talk just for a moment about some choices that we can actually make that help there to be high biodiversity on this planet. So if you have a yard, for instance, you could plant different types of native plant species in your yard. We didn't talk about native versus invasive. We're not going to talk about that today, but choosing good plants that are part of a really healthy natural community in Ontario can help us to then have a healthy biodiverse space because those plants are kind of, in a way, they're in the same family, not classification wise, but they develop together in that community, and they've evolved together. So if you have an opportunity to plant native plant species, that's great. Even if you have a balcony but no yard, you can plant them in pots. That's one choice you can make. Another choice you can make is if you decide to walk instead of drive. Right? Maybe some of you walk to school. I mean, if you're walking to school, some of you are walking from your bedroom to the living room right now, but even going to a shop or something like that. If you walk instead of drive, then that means there's less fuel that's being pulled out of the ground to make your car run. If you are buying products that have less packaging, that's a good thing, right? So if they have more packaging, then, well, that packaging had to come from somewhere. The packaging, the fuel, these are from resources on this planet. And if we're pulling those resources from the planet, then we're actually disturbing, potentially destroying habitat where those resources existed in the earth before that. So by using less, fewer products, walking more, we can actually ensure that fewer habitats are disrupted. There was one more, oh yes, the water. So if we're not using as much water, or if we're trying to avoid polluting water, for instance, then that means that habitats that are aquatic, water-based habitats, can be healthier. So now that we've talked about biodiversity and why it's important, choices we can make, I'd like to address some of the questions you might have had during this live stream. Will's nodding. He's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of questions. Thank you, Will. I haven't been able to see them as we've been walking. If you need to go at this point, it's been lovely to have you, and this recording will be available afterwards. But if you're able to stay, Will, would you mind sharing some of the questions that people have been asking?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start off with one of the first ones that we have here, and it is, how many plants and animals are in the forest around us, do you think?
Oh, wow. How many plants or animals are in the forest around us? Oh my gosh. So different types of plants, so different species of plant. This is a bit of a wild guess, or maybe it's an educated guess. I suspect that in this forest, there must be a couple of hundred different species of plant. And I'm considering the mosses as well. I'm grouping lichen into that plant category. So there are different lichens on the trees. So we have trees, shrubs, wildflowers, mosses, lichens, and it does tend to add up. Animals, mammal-wise, there are deer here, foxes, rabbits, groundhogs, bats. Awesome, I love bats. And bird-wise, there are a number of birds that live here, but there are a lot that migrate through. So we're getting into the probably 100 different bird species that would migrate through. That might even be low. Where the numbers really rocket up are the insects. So when we get into butterflies and bees and beetles and really tiny insects, even bees, like there are, gosh, I think in the world there are something like 20,000 different bee species. So if we're factoring in all of the animals, I have to guess like it would be 1,000 or more. Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't really done an assessment here. I used to work at this particular site for a number of years, but I haven't really done a count. Good question.
Another great question that we had was, can high biodiversity ever have a negative impact on the environment?
Oh, interesting thought. I've never been asked that before. So when we think about, I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive species here. High biodiversity usually means there's a lot of different, well, it does mean there are a lot of different organisms, and something that can disrupt that would be like dog strangling vine or garlic mustard or Phragmites. This is in this area in the GTA. These are invasive plant species that will come into a habitat and they take over the space, really disrupting that biodiversity, and they reduce the amount of biodiversity in that habitat. That's not a good thing. I can't think of an instance where high biodiversity would be a bad thing, to be honest. So I'm going to venture no on first thought. If I thought about that more, I can't imagine a case where we'd have a negative impact from high biodiversity.
Another question that we have, where are we today?
Where are we today? Yes, I actually meant to mention that in the very beginning. So we are in the GTA. We're actually in Richmond Hill. We are just kind of north of Toronto proper, I suppose. And we're at a site called Lake St. George Field Center, where I mentioned that we do overnight field trips. Usually, right now we're not able to do that. In Ontario, Canada, planet Earth, solar system, universe.
Just today, you kind of listed off some of the animals that we have here. What are some of the animals that maybe you've just seen today? You mentioned deer. Have you seen anything else, Ryan?
Yes. So I haven't seen a lot of insects because a lot of them have already started going into their kind of dormant winter state. But I have noticed a number of birds flitting about. So I've seen some robins, and I think I noticed a blue jay or two earlier. And then there were some birds that they might have been some late migrants, like little kinglets that were flitting about in the trees. Oh, and while I haven't seen them, I have heard a lot of red squirrels. I'm not sure if you've heard that jittering sound, kind of like so there are red squirrels in this forest as well. I'm even seeing, oh, I wish I could show you these things close up, but as soon as the bird flies, then it's in the shrubs and then we can't see it anymore.
Where was this question that I just saw here? How can we help with biodiversity at home or in my own area?
Excellent. Yeah. So in your own area, I mentioned if you have access to be able to plant biodiverse, like an array of plants in your own yard space, if you have that available to you, that's great. If that isn't, then if we weren't in a pandemic, I'd say you could look for events, like planting events, where you can help with public spaces and planting different plants that are provided at those events to help make those spaces more biodiverse. But even things like if you're in a wilderness space near you, maybe there's a local park that has a wilderness space to it. It's really great to stay on the trails. This sounds so simple and you're like, well, what difference does that make? But staying on the trails are put there for us to walk on and still enjoy the space. If we stay on the trails, what it means is that we're not trampling plants, or even if it's a time of year where plants aren't growing, we're not compressing the soil. If you're compressing the soil in a wilderness space, then that means water can't get in because the soil is too compressed, squished together. It means plants can't, if water can't get in, the plants can't grow. So going off trail in these wilderness spaces can actually have a bigger impact than we think if they're in a space that a lot of people visit. If I'm going up to Muskoka, let's say, then, and I'm going camping, then it's less of an impact because there are fewer people. It's still great to stay on trails, but the impact is higher when we're in kind of urban areas. Other things you can do locally, just make those decisions. Like I mentioned, buying smart. So buying less packaging, and walking more. Anything that helps a bigger community can also help your smaller community. So everything is connected, as we said.
And the last question, are there any dangerous animals or plants that are in our area?
Are there any dangerous animals or plants in our area? So I'm going to venture that we're speaking about the GTA. I know we have some folks joining us from other areas as well. Dangerous is kind of a tricky word. So there are some plants that humans can react to, and we might see them as being dangerous. I just see them as plants that we need to kind of be aware of and be careful of. And so poison ivy, you might have heard about that. If you're allergic to poison ivy, then you can react to that. The plant itself isn't dangerous. It's just if we go against it and, we get a reaction. So it can cause that kind of rash or injury, I suppose. There are, I'm trying to think of other plants. So nettle, stinging nettle, people who know how to use it, they'll make a tea out of the leaves, I believe, but it actually also causes an unusual tingly feeling. So that's another plant you want to be careful of. When it comes to any plant, I mentioned people making a tea out of stinging nettle leaves. You never want to do that. You never want to consume a plant if you don't know for sure what it is and how to consume it safely. So just keep that in mind. Things can be dangerous, like even milkweed. The milky substance that's in the milkweed plant, it's actually something that we should not be consuming. So it could cause some kind of a reaction if we were to eat or drink, I guess, that milkweed liquid. As far as animals are concerned, to be honest, the most dangerous animal that we probably have is the human because of all the negative impacts that we can have on habitats. But that's not the question or the answer you're most likely looking for, because humans can also have a positive impact. We do want to reinforce that. Dangerous animals. A lot of people get worried about spiders, but generally, they're not going to jump out at you. So as long as you're respectful of them, they're respectful of you, and they don't usually cause problems. A lot of bees don't sting, solitary bees, for instance. No interest in stinging. But if you have an allergy to a bee that is a colony nesting bee, then that could be dangerous for some people, for sure. So yeah, there are some, but it's really about how you relate to the animals and how you might personally have a reaction to different types of species. And that was our last question, I think.
If there are questions that the people have in chat, Ryan and I will be answering them through text. So the live stream, we're just going to finish up right now.
Great. So as Will mentioned, in the description or below the description, with the chat that is taking place during the live stream is going to be saved with the live stream, but there will be an ongoing chat afterwards that you can contribute to. So just to wrap up, some things that you can do in your schoolyard if you're interested. You can set up a quad activity in your schoolyard and use rope, hoops. You can use sticks, make a square out of 4 sticks and just use those same sticks to go somewhere else and do that same assessment again. Watershed on Wheels is the kind of overarching umbrella under which Will and I do our in-school programs. And so during this time, we've actually created some e-learning resources that are available. We'll put the link into I think we'll put it into the description afterwards for that. And just so you know, in a couple of weeks on the 18th, we have a grade 1 live stream, so about seasonal changes. So you can tune into that to find out about these upcoming live streams. We're planning on running them every 2 weeks. You can go to the TRCA, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority event calendar, and the link will be made available as well for that. And finally, keep exploring, everybody. Have a great time on this amazing planet, exploring the wonders of biodiversity in the natural communities that are all around us. It's been great having you here today. I'm so excited that you were able to join us. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.